Even zien. Ja. Goedemorgen. Good morning. We hebben op dit moment een technische briefing over de verordening Natuurherstel. And I will switch to English because of our guest. I'll first introduce the members of Parliament that are here. Welcome to Mr. Thijssen from the Socialist Party, Ms. Akkerboom from the Party for the Animals, Mr. Boswijk from the Christian Democrat Party, and Mr. Geert de Groot from D66, the Democratic Party. And I'm Mevrouw Koekkoek from Volt. I will first hand over the floor to Mr. Delgado Rosa, who will have, I think, a presentation of about 20-25 minutes. And then I will invite each member to ask. We'll start off with one question and then the answer, and then we'll see how it goes in terms of the time. So, Mr. Delgado Rosa, welcome, and you have the floor.
Good morning. Thank you very much. First, I would like to thank the members of the Parliament for the chance to present to you the EU Nature Restoration Law. I hope you hear me well. And as you may know, this Nature Restoration Law was presented by the Commission as a regulation in the 22nd of June of this year, and is now being discussed with the co-legislators, the Council and the Parliament. So I'm very happy to present the elements of it. I trust that you will be able to pass the slides for me, so we could move to next slide, please. Okay. First point I wanted to make is this, of course, derives from the European Green Deal, which has this element of protecting and restoring nature. It was expressed in the EU Biodiversity Strategy to 2030, this ambitious strategy we have, within which there's a reference to this upcoming proposal for binding targets on nature restoration. And indeed, to counter biodiversity loss, we need not only to protect, but also to restore, because we have lost much the ecosystem services that we need from nature.
Mr.
So
Delgado Rosa,
slide, please.
Mr. Delgado Rosa, I'm sorry to interrupt. We have somewhat technical things to fix. Some of the members can't see your presentation, so... Oh, you can all see the presentation. Okay, sorry, never mind. And then there's another technical issue. One of the members online has not muted, so I kindly ask them to mute their microphone. I'm sorry for the interruption. Please continue.
So I hope I don't need to go back to the slides, and I will proceed with this one. What I was here trying to show is the main elements of the EU biodiversity strategy, which just have a chapter on nature protection, but a very relevant one on restoring nature, with an EU Nature Restoration Plan, within which there's this announcement of the upcoming proposal that we have tabled in June, and also elements towards enabling a transformative change and looking into the global agenda. So next slide, please. This next slide is to signal the global context indeed. We are heading, it will be now in December in Canada, to another COP, not a climate COP, but a biodiversity COP conference of the parties, where the world should reach a new global deal for nature. And the past deals, the one of 2000, until there was one aiming to halt biodiversity loss to 2010, that failed. The second one aimed to halt biodiversity loss to 2020, and it failed. The next one cannot just repeat, we will stop biodiversity. It needs to be much more ambitious in terms of quantifying and following up what we as parties will do. So the EU aims to lead by example through its own biodiversity strategy, of which the Nature Restoration Law is a component. The next slide, please. This is the basic structure of the Nature Restoration Regulation proposal. In essence, it has one overarching objective described here at the right, which aims to have by 2030 restoration measures in 20% of used land and sea, so that by 2050 we can have measures in place for all ecosystems that need restoration. And this overall objective derives from specific restoration targets. I will be referring to them in the next slides. And within the proposal, there's an implementation framework, including national restoration plans and monitoring and reporting. So this is the basic structure of the regulation. Let me go then a bit more specific. Next slide, please. On specific restoration targets, you see here as the full set of specific targets, how they are organized. And these first two slots here at the left, protected habitat types and habitats at protected species, they derive mostly from the Birds and Habitats directives that, as you know, pre-exist for some 30 years. So let's say for these habitats and species that are already protected, what we aim at is to set now some timelines and specific targets for them. But you see, it also goes well beyond the Birds and Habitats Directive, covering marine habitats, urban ecosystems, river connectivity, pollinators, agro ecosystems, and forest ecosystems. I'll try to say a bit of these specific targets in the next slide. So we can move to the next one, please. Well, I'm missing here a target. It's probably out of place, but just to say, here are some examples of habitat restoration that the Netherlands has done that exactly go towards restoring protected sites, be it raised bogs, lowland fens, wetlands, peat ponds, rivers. You have quite some experience in the Netherlands, and there was support from the LIFE program towards it. But what I wanted to signal again, or this is related to protected habitats, they aim to improve the condition by measures to be established to a certain percentage, so 30% by 2030, 60% by 2040, 90% by 2050, measures to improve the condition of these listed protected habitats and species, to the extent needed also re-establish habitats when they were lost, and also tackling habitats that are needed for protected species. But the main point I do here, as I say, let's say the legal duty to restore to favorable conservation status pre-exists. What you are bringing in mostly is figures and the timeline towards that. The next slide, please. Now going into the non-protected habitats targets, one that will be of interest for the Netherlands is certainly this that addresses urban ecosystems. Basically, what we are proposing first is to stop the loss of urban green space by 2030. We are still losing green coverage in EU urban areas, and then towards 2040 and 2050 to increase the total national area of urban green space with some minimum of 10% urban tree canopy cover by 2050. By no means this stands in the way of urban development. What we are here signaling is that urban development can and should be planned in such a way as to incorporate green rooftops, green walls, parks, trees, etc., that actually serve citizens better in their quality of life and also make the cities more resilient towards, namely, impacts of climate change. The next slide, please. The target on river connectivity, well, it builds on a target that was already signaled in the biodiversity strategy, which is this target to reach at least 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers in the EU by 2030. What we are asking the member states is to identify and remove barriers that are obsolete and prevent the connectivity of surface waters so that we can revive the river ecosystems. The next one, please. Very important also in the context of the debates around food security. Without pollination, food security would be at stake. And we know that there's a very noticeable decline of pollinated populations. So this target aims to reverse that decline and achieve thereafter for this group of species an increasing trend until having satisfactory levels. So we also propose in the regulation a methodology that allows for the annual monitoring and reporting of what is happening with pollinators in the EU. The next slide, please. Here, let me try to explain, because both the agriculture ecosystem target and the forest ecosystem target has raised some misunderstandings. First point is, when we restore, we are not doing it for the sake of nature. We are doing it for the sake of the ecosystem services that humans need from nature. And actually, both farmland ecosystems and forest ecosystems, I'll refer to them after this one, have lost a lot of those services. So we do know of some indicators that are correlated with restoring the ecosystem services that agriculture activity itself requires. So what we are proposing is that member states at national level should reach an increasing trend in some indicators until satisfactory levels that they will define themselves, the member states, are achieved. And these indicators are here listed. The grassland butterfly index. Butterflies in grasslands are associated with good quality of the agricultural ecosystems, the stock of organic carbon in cropland mineral soils, and also the share of high diversity landscape features that were lost in many parts of Europe and which serve as habitats for many species which are beneficial for the ecosystem. There is a specific target to enhance the farmland bird index at national level. Again, farmland birds are also associated with the quality of the ecosystem. And let me develop a bit more also on the specific case of drained peatlands under agriculture use. First point is we should keep in mind that although drained peatlands under agriculture use are around 3% of the agriculture area in the EU only, they are responsible for 25% of the emissions from agriculture. So from a climate perspective, it's very important to address peatland and to restore peatland. That's why you find this proposed target, which aims to have restoration measures. You have the figures here, 30% by 2030, 50% 2040, 7% by 2050, in a certain proportion from rewetting, drained peatland. But there is also ingrained in the proposal a lot of flexibility. We know that some member states, including the Netherlands, have much more peatlands than others. So these flexibility clauses allow member states to identify other peatland not under agriculture use, such as peat extraction sites or other types of drained peatlands that can also, in certain proportions, be used to accomplish this target, which is one of the targets where the link between biodiversity and climate is more evident. The next slide, please. Can we have the next slide?
We are trying to fix some computer issues. It's coming up.
Okay, thank you. If it gets difficult, I can as well pass without. It's just more lively with the slides, I hope. Perfect, thank you very much. I was now referring to the non-protected forest ecosystems, where, so you see both for agriculture and forests, there are some forests that are protected, that they are covered under the targets derived from the protected habitats and species, but here for the non-protected is likewise in agriculture. What we propose is to achieve an increasing trend in indicators that we know are associated not only with forest biodiversity, but more specifically with forest resilience, the capacity of forests to be more diverse, more capable to stand threats like pests, forest fires, or droughts. And these are the indicators we have selected among several, noticeably indicators that member states already monitor, such as the standing deadwood, lying deadwood, the age structure, the connectivity, the birds again, or the stock of organic carbon. So you see on this organization of the targets, some like the protected species and habitats, we know where we want to get is favorable conservation status, and we have the monitoring for that. For these habitats, we request a positive trend on indicators that correlate with ecosystem services that we all need. The next slide, please. Now to say a bit more of what we call the implementation framework of the proposal. So it runs very much around national restoration plans that member states are expected to prepare. And these plans should look into the map areas, the quantification of the areas in need of restoration, also taking a good look into the synergies, not only with climate change, but also with other plans and strategies that apply to the territory. On terms of contents, member states should quantify and describe what restoration measures they foresee, also how they will address that whatever is restored is not deteriorated with the timing for implementation, and very importantly, how this will be financed and how will the stakeholders be supported towards restoration. On process, we attach a lot of importance to this element of participation. One cannot expect successful restoration if those involved are not supporting it, involved, consulted, participating. So basically, we are proposing that the national restoration plans are submitted to the Commission after 2 years. The Commission will make observations to the plans, but there is no process of formal approval of the plans foreseen. And then on monitoring and reporting, there's also provisions on the need for member states to report how the plan is being implemented and how the results are being achieved and the measures being put in place. The next slide. On the very important point of financing, we foresee that several sources of financing, including EU funds, but also national funds and private funds, can and should be used for restoration. Just to set the stage in terms of EU funding, in the current multi-annual financial framework, we estimate there are around some 100 billion of euros available for biodiversity. And indeed, the biodiversity strategy had already foreseen that some 20 billion per year should be unlocked for biodiversity for financing biodiversity. Actually, the current multi-annual financial framework, 2021-2027, has for the first time a biodiversity target. So biodiversity spending does have a hard target, as climate also has one, which is 7.5 as from 2024 and 10% as from 2026 and 2027. So this does bring a big impulse to attribute EU funds to biodiversity. The funds are listed here to my right. There are several that can be used and planned to cover for biodiversity needs, including restoration. And we are also having other instruments that stimulate that private funding also comes in this direction, such as the EU taxonomy, signaling what are the right green investments also for nature. And in InvestEU, there is this initiative on natural capital and circular economy that should unlock 10 billion during the period for public and private blended finance, including for nature restoration. The next slide, please. One word on benefits. We did do a thorough impact assessment before tabling the proposal, which pays quite some attention to costs and benefits. And the summary is that overall, for €1 spent on restoration, we get a return on investment of at least €8, often more. And there are many examples of from where this derives. I've selected here 3. When we reverse the declining pollinators, we boost agriculture, especially for certain crops that are dependent on pollination. When forests are more biodiverse, they get more resilient to climate change. So in the end, overall, the economic benefit we get from the forests also benefits. And when we restore marine ecosystems, well, fish stocks recover. And these little fishes you see here is from an actual case of restoration in a French marine restoration project, where during the years one can see how fish get bigger, and when they are caught, then there's a benefit for fisheries. The next slide. This slide is misplaced. It should have been right after when I referred to the protected habitats, but so it's basically repeating what we are proposing for these habitats in Annex 1 and Annex 2, which is improving their condition, re-establish as needed in these percentages, and also to improve the quality and quantity and connectivity of habitats for important species. So I'm just repeating what I said. Sorry for the slide not being in the right place. And I think I'm reaching the final slide after this one. Yeah, not only just to thank you, but also to say that I do hope the Netherlands, which, as I referred previously, has quite some capacity and experience on nature restoration for the sake of people, as I like to put it, will be supportive of this proposal and helping us in the co-decision process to get a good and ambitious nature restoration law, because, well, we need it in Europe and worldwide. Thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward for any questions or discussion.
Thank you so much, Mr. Delgado Rosa. Before I give the floor to the members, let me take the opportunity to welcome one more member, Mr. Van Kampen from the Liberal Party, who is joining us online. Hi, Tom. And then I will give each member first the opportunity to, I think, provide one question, and then we do an answer directly, because we're online, that's easier, and then we'll see how we go. So you have the floor, Mr. Thijssen.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to Mr. Delgado Rosa for the presentation. It's very interesting. And it's impressive to see that €1 spent on this will have a return of €8, apart from the fact that nature has a value in itself, I think. But it's also good to know that money-wise we're doing smart things. Now, we had a response from our government on this proposal, and there are some worries about the deterioration. How do we say this in English? So it's forbidden that nature becomes worse outside of the Nature 2000 areas. So already that is the European directive inside Nature 2000 areas, but now the proposal is also to do it outside. And there are some worries about that, if that is possible in a densely populated country like the Netherlands. So can you say a bit more why this is in the proposal? And do you think this is indeed possible in a densely populated area as the Netherlands?
If I understand, I reply directly. Let me explain the sense of this provision. Basically, it would be senseless to spend money on putting in place restoration measures that would then be dismantled by allowing deterioration. So this is the sense of the proposal, where restoration measures kick in. Well, the objective, the result to be achieved should not be destroyed, making it a bad investment. So in that sense, it's not establishing Natura 2000-like rules everywhere. And of course, one can take into account issues of force majeure. So let's say if climate change itself would kick in and have impacts that would change the situation. And there's, of course, room for exceptions and compensation when duly needed. So we don't think there's an issue that would make it more difficult in a densely populated country, because even a densely populated country, when planning how to do restoration, we certainly aim to do it in such a way that the benefits are there to stay and not to be then dismantled. So we pay due attention to this concern by the Netherlands, but we are trusting that we can, in dialogue, find a good solution that dismisses such concerns.
Thank you. Ms. Ackerman?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for your presentation. Our party also noticed the concerns about the non-deterioration requirement. And additional to my colleague, I want to ask, currently we already have the Bird and Habitat Directive, under which we think that it also already applies to species that are protected outside of a Natura 2000 area. And we were wondering, what is the additional legal consequences of adding a non-deterioration requirement in the EU nature restoration law?
Let me say that everything that relates to the Birds and Habitats directives pre-exists legally. So let's say for 30 years, there is this duty to restore to favorable conservation status in addition to protecting. So we really don't think that what we are proposing in the nature restoration law is really new in terms of obligation. What we are saying is now there's a timeline for that. Now, of course, even without the nature restoration law, it wouldn't make sense where you protect and restore to allow to deteriorate. So my perception is, and tell me if I'm wrong, that the concerns on non-deterioration should not be too related to the Birds and Habitats Directive, species and habitats as protected. Now, for the remainder, for what I call the non-protected, those that I've said where we are proposing a positive trend, notice we are not even defining how much positive. There's no quantification on that. We are requesting a positive trend at national level. So if in a specific situation where, let's say, a new unforeseen development is needed in an area where a trend was positive, if that's compensated by the overall trend, I'm thinking of farmland or forest land, for instance, that would be compatible with the nature restoration law. So again, I understand the concerns on the practicalities of addressing non-deterioration, but on the viability of tackling it, we are convinced we are proposing something that is feasible, and we very much want to keep dialogue with the Netherlands and other member states around it.
Thank you so much. Mr. Boswijk.
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Chair. Is it possible that we also received the presentation that we have seen just yet? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Delgado Rosa, for your presentation. My main question is, how are other member states reacting on this plan? And about the percentage, you mentioned already the 30, the 60 and the 90%. Is this for the European as a whole, or is it also as for the individual member states? Because as Netherlands, we are a quite populated country, and maybe there are bigger countries where it is easier to get to this percentage. Is there a difference between these member states? Thank you.
Well, I say there's not a difference on the overall percentages as such, but of course there's an obvious difference when you go habitat per habitat. I mean, we cannot expect, let's say, Austria to have marine targets or Malta to have many forest targets, to give an example. So overall, there's a difference on the effort per habitat type, but the effort as such is evenly spread. Thus, the percentages we are proposing do apply to member states also, including densely populated, because then it's a matter of addressing the adequate amount of restoration in the several habitats, including urban context, farmland context, forest context.
Thank you so much. Mr. Van Kampen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Delgado Rosa, for your presentation. My question is actually the same as my colleague from the Animals Party asked, is if you can elaborate a bit more about the judicial consequences of the nature restoration law compared to the Bird and Habitat Directive. As you might know, we are in this country in a nitrogen crisis we are facing as a consequence of the government taking too less responsibility for the obligations in that bird and habitat directive, but could you reflect a bit more and elaborate a bit more about on the judicial consequences of the nature and restoration law, and how do we prevent us from becoming in this same situation as we're in now, right now, regarding the nitrogen crisis?
Okay, let me just then maybe refer a bit more to the nitrogen crisis that we follow closely also here from the Commission. Indeed, the nitrogen crisis that the Netherlands is facing, yes, of course, it has a link with the Birds and Habitats directives, but it does not derive from it, in my perception. As you kind of signaled, there was here a period where nitrogen was approaching such a way that the consequences were mounting. But it's our understanding that it was a national court that has suspended the plan you had to address nitrogen and causing the crisis as such. So I'm just signaling, yes, that there's a link with EU legislation, but it's a rather specific situation from a process that through many years have accumulated a nitrogen problem. So in this context, I don't think that the nature restoration law will be aggravating anything that pre-exists, because on the link with the Birds and Habitats Directive, again, we are not bringing in a real novelty in addition to the timing and the percentages now to reach the favorable conservation status. That's the main input. So far, the Birds and Habitats Directive had no timing to reach favorable conservation status. But we are living in a context where we cannot allow ourselves to wait centuries to get nature restoration back. So this is what I can say. I don't foresee that. Actually, I do believe that the plans, I also have a cat, so you have my sympathy. I say that the plans that the Dutch government is forcing to address the nitrogen crisis, in our perception, will all go in coherence with what we are proposing in the nature restoration law and not the reverse.
Thank you. And it's nice to see the cat, Mr. Van Kamp. I'd like to give the floor to Mr. De Groot.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Delgado Rosa, for your presentation. It has been asked already, but it is not entirely clear to me what the difference is between the deterioration principle in this proposal and the Article 6.3 in the Habitat Directive. Can you elaborate a little bit on the differences to what you propose and the Birds and Habitat Directive? Thank you very much.
Yes, well, let me first start then by the Birds and Habitats Directive, or if you want, Article 6.3 and 6.4, the Habitats Directive. The Habitats Directive was very innovative and ambitious indeed on bringing to a large geographical scale what I would call the reversal of the burden of proof. So basically, for those sites that are designated as important for habitats and species of EU concern, of EU value, if you want to do something that puts a stake conservation, it's for the promoter to demonstrate the compatibility with the conservation objectives. And in case of non-compatibility, there are several clauses that still allow the project to go ahead with compensation, overriding public interest, and so forth. The nature restoration law is not bringing anything new, nor enlarging this principle to everywhere. So for the habitats and habitats of species that derive from the Birds and Habitats Directive, the same principles of the directives apply. For the non-protected, where we aim to this trend, a positive trend, it's not the same principles that apply. So to give the example I was giving, if, let's imagine forests, the country has started a positive trend on those indicators. It does not mean that everywhere you cannot have an activity that reduces the indicator, provided overall you still have the positive trend. So this is very different from an Article 6.3 approach. I hope this helps clarify.
Thank you very much. Very clear.
Thank you very much. I also have one question. You mentioned in the presentation that you hope for the strong support of the Netherlands because the Netherlands has already quite some capacity and experience in reaching the objectives that are in this regulation. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that. What do you see that the Netherlands already does really well, has a best practice on in terms of these objectives?
Well, thank you. Well, it brings to my mind your question, the recent Nature Directors meeting we held under the Czech presidency, where there was a lovely presentation by the Dutch colleague on several cases of restoration related to rivers, to flood prevention, to making urban rivers better for people. So, of course, you know much better the Netherlands than I do, but you do have very specific challenges in terms of coastal defense, in terms of water level, in terms of rivers. And we know of several cases where the Netherlands has applied good knowledge on bringing back nature, be it protected habitats and species, the examples I've given from life projects, but also these examples are on how well you manage water in such a way that you can make it revive nature, again, for the sake of humans. I'm quoting my commissioner on this. He said it recently in the Agri-Fish Council where nature restoration law was discussed. This is not about nature for the sake of nature. It's about nature for the sake of people. And you, a densely populated country with some, let's say, geographical challenges that you know very well, you have a capacity to manage your territory where you can put, you have demonstrated this in concrete cases, you can put nature back for the service of people. So Netherlands and water and nature, in my mind, link very well. And I would expect from that we can all benefit in the EU from your capacity and support for these objectives.
Thank you. And then I think we'll start the next round of questions. Mr. Thijssen.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I have a question on the agricultural landscape or areas that you mentioned, and that they also can bring back more biodiversity and more nature. That's also a discussion we have in our Parliament. And are the criteria for what you envision for what this landscape should look like and when it's basically good enough to restore nature and biodiversity, are those criteria already finished and clear, or is that also part of the process that is now happening in Europe?
Well, let's say, referring specifically to what we call high biodiversity landscape features, we have this discussion as is ongoing for long, and also in the context of the Common Agriculture Policy, which does have one so-called general agriculture and environmental conditions. One of them relates to landscape features. So there is a definition of what counts as a landscape feature. We are basically referring to individual trees, edges, ponds, stone walls, all these elements that used to be a good part of the landscape, of the overall farmland landscape, and in some areas of Europe, not all, but in some, were lost in the last decades in immense quantities. Now, it happens that these landscape features are habitat and refuge for many species, which themselves are needed to maintain this flow of ecosystem services that are relevant for agricultural productivity itself. The flow of nutrients, the pollinators, the parasites that can attack the pests that are bad for agriculture, this capacity to keep the fertility ongoing, this is also lost from this landscape features loss. So this goes very well with the Common Agriculture Policy, this increase in landscape features, and it goes well also with the instruments that member states can use within the Common Agriculture Policy, such as the eco schemes, which can be shaped towards this. Now, one important distinction. We hear some member states saying, oh, but what about grasslands as such? Aren't grasslands relevant for the environment? And yes, they are. Extensive grazing in grasslands is actually maintaining the ecosystem and is relevant for the environment. But here we are not referring to landscapes as such, and the grassland, I would claim, is a landscape. We are referring to landscape features, these individual elements that are, I believe, properly defined. And if we would just count full landscapes as extensive grasslands, this would overflow the objective that is in the biodiversity strategy to 2030 to reach 10% of landscape features back into our fields. I hope this helps clarify. We believe, doing several initiatives that are coherent and help each other. The targets in the biodiversity strategy and in the farm to fork strategy, together with the common agriculture policy objectives and also the nature restoration law, they all push in a side that is relevant for the long-term food security of our continent. And I call your attention for a recent report from the Commission's Joint Research Center that exactly has looked into nature restoration versus food productivity. Well, the best insurance we can have is to restore nature to maintain in the long run food productivity.
Thank you very much. Ms. Akkerman?
Thank you, and thank you for the, well, you told us a lot about deterioration, and that cleared up a lot for us. I had a question about the legal status of the law. Could you clarify whether the goals and targets of the nature restoration law are all legally binding or whether they are key commitments? And could you elaborate which goals are legally binding and which ones are commitment and how that relates to each other?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And actually what I can clarify is, let's say these specific targets are legally binding. The ones I've been describing on protected habitats, marine, urban, forest, etc., pollinators, etc. Those are the legally binding ones. What I've called the overall objective, that's in Article 1 of the proposal, is our evaluation of what these specific targets will entail. This overall target of 20% of EU land and sea with restoration measures in place is not as such legally binding. It derives from the legally binding ones. And I profit just to clarify one thing that sometimes also raises doubts, which is why do we say 20% of restoration measures instead of restoration results by 2030? Well, because nature and the different habitats require different amounts of time to be restored. So when having measures in place, that's what can be achievable up to 2030, while results as such, that depends on the habitat and the time it requires to be restored. But I hope this clarifies what is or is not legally binding in our proposal.
Thank you very much. Mr. De Groot.
Thank you very much. I have a question on the global perspective, which is on land use. A lot of land, also in Europe and the Netherlands, is used for growing feed for animals, which makes the food system very inefficient, because you better give rest materials to animals, proteins that people don't want or cannot eat. So according to this land use discussion, the current food system is not able to feed 10 billion people, which is also a direct threat to world's biodiversity. Is this also an aspect in your strategy?
Well, it's not a direct aspect in the strategy, no, but it is somehow a very relevant topic that underlies much of the political discussions that are ongoing. If you just think all the push to address food security, the drivers of food security, the lack of fertilizers, all this does bring some fundamental questions of the ones you've tackled. First, we don't have a food security issue in Europe at this stage because, well, we can well produce for our demand and even to export. There is an issue food affordability in the current context where with inflation. But when one looks into how much of our crops and of our cereals go for feed and how many crops go for bioenergy, then we can see that that element, together with how much food waste we have, that goes up to 20%, how much we could benefit from shifting diets, which is a tendency that some people in the world, also with the young generations, have. All this can help us manage the issue of food versus planet, or if you want, food versus the quality of the environment, on which it depends, in a way that remains sustainable for those 10 billion to come if we get there. So yeah, again, we are not directly discussing what diets or what crops should be done, but of course, nature restoration and these positive trends match well with wider considerations on food security and in the long run.
Thank you very much. Mr. Van Kampen, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I have another question again about the Bird and Habitat Directive, and it might sound a bit off topic, but I think it isn't, since a lot of, speaking for myself, skeptical views upon this law derives from the situation we're in now regarding to the nitrogen problem. A lot of people always say, okay, this nitrogen situation regarding to the Bird and Habitat Directive is a national problem we made ourselves. It's a judicial problem we made ourselves, and then they say, just go to the European Commission and ask if there's some space to change things upon this, and then we'll solve this problem. Myself, I think that's a strategy we've tried in the past, but that didn't work. But what would you say to these voices and to these people who think that might be the problem, the possible solution to solve this problem?
Well, I would say that's very unlikely. That's a solution for the nitrogen crisis would come on lowering standards in the Water Framework Directive, the Nitrates Directive, the Birds and Habitats Directive. Let me start in this way. It's often forgotten that excess nutrients is one of the planetary boundaries that we have already overpassed. We are having eutrophication and excess of nitrogen in many places of the world. Yes, in the Netherlands, you came to a very specific situation where suddenly what was accumulating along many years just blowed into politics and brought many difficulties. But I don't think it's fair to say that that is because of the Birds and Habitats Directive or the Nitrates Directive or the Water Framework Directive as such. Let me just pick on the Nitrates Directive. The Nitrates Directive, first, it aims to protect public health from excess nitrates in water. But second, it's probably one, maybe the only or one of the very clear directives that does set a limit to how intensive should agriculture be. And it's an agronomic limit, how much manure should be put in land depending on the capacity of the land. So would it be reasonable to believe, well, let's lower that standard, let's allow to put much more manure, and there we are out of the woods in terms of nitrogen? No, you would not. Your habitats would be much worse, your water would be much worse, the cost to treat water would be much worse. So I think we follow with a lot of interest this tension you have in your country between how to reshape land use and agriculture to solve the problem, but betting on going to for the EU as a whole to lower its standards on water quality, on health and on nature, I don't think that would be at all politically viable or, let's say, a good option overall to conduct the society.
Thank you very much. I also have a question which is a bit related to the question of Ms. Akerboom earlier. So what I was wondering is, in this regulation, there are legal objectives that are specific to this regulation. And so my question relates to other strategies that are possibly directly or indirectly also influencing the practical measures. So think of, for example, what you mentioned before, the farm-to-fork strategy, or the Fit for 55 strategy, or even the forest strategy that are now upcoming. In what way do you expect these strategies that are containing binding but also non-binding objectives to influence practical measures that we, for example, in the Netherlands, need to take in terms of agriculture? Do you already foresee something like that?
Well, let me say, I do believe, I often, let's say in the political debate, sometimes some voices saying, oh, there's a lot of fragmentation, many initiatives coming, each one pulling its own direction. I think this is a very wrong diagnosis of what we are doing with the full set of initiatives, including legislative initiatives that derive from the Green Deal. They are all pushing in the same direction, which is overall sustainability. It's the I don't think the world has many crises. The big crisis we have to solve in this century is global sustainability, including in Europe. And that's what the Green Deal is about. It's about transformative change, but not about trade-offs. It's about synergies between the different areas towards sustainability. So everything you've referred, let's look again. The biodiversity strategy, it has 3 targets in common with the farm to fork strategy: on organic farming, on excess fertilization, on excess use of pesticides. It has also this specific target on 10% landscape features that I've referred. Then deriving from the biodiversity strategy, we had the forest strategy that goes very much in the direction of shaping our forests towards, yes, a solid and robust bioeconomy, but also more delivery for climate objectives and for biodiversity objectives. The soil strategy, going in the same direction of bringing to soil the level of protection that we are used to have for air and water. It was a kind of an orphan ecosystem, now covered also in coherence, indeed, with nature restoration, because if you do address contaminated soils to bring them back to be decontaminated, you are giving a very important contribution to nature restoration. And to settle all this, you also referred Fit for 55. Well, I just pick one element from there, which is the land use change and forestry regulation, recently approved, which requires from member states more land-based carbon sinks. Now, imagine exactly how we have shaped the nature restoration law towards addressing those ecosystems that deliver the most for as carbon sinks. So the coherence exists there, and the agriculture sector should be picking from this overall message of sustainability and the elements that come from all the sides, including the common agriculture policy, that are pushing towards a transition, which is not always easy. And again, your nitrogen crisis shows it. But we need the public goods that derive from these policies. And for that, that's where public money should kick in to help the transition of those in difficulty, leaving no one behind as from the EU Green Deal.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for a few more questions from the members. So anybody, I'm looking at the members, anybody who wants to? Sorry. Mr. De Groot.
What I find very interesting, Mr. Delgado Rosa, is the counting you do with €1 investment brings €8 back on leverage for society. Can you tell us more on the counting and the assumptions which you used therein? Because that's a very innovative way of thinking about public goods. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, all the details as such, the studies, etc., are in our impact assessment. So I cannot delve into the details, but I can tell you this is a conservative estimate. When we say for €1 you get at least €8, we are not even counting all the ecosystem services and their value. Often we are based, for instance, on the value, let's say, as carbon sinks, for instance, which is huge. So indeed, this value does exist. Now, one word of caution. Of course, when we are able to monetize, to evaluate what ecosystem services they provide to us, not all of this can go into private flows of the economy. That's where public policy is so important. So if we can understand that from investing €1, we get a return over all of society of €8, well, that's where public funds should come to ensure that the funding exists so that we all benefit from this value, which is not all capturable by the market, to put it this way. Some ecosystem services are. Imagine, I'm a water company, I need to treat water. So of course, if someone, instead of intensive livestock farming, puts there a nice semi-natural forest that helps me get better water quality, reducing my cost of treatment, I can convert this into a value that can be paid back to those that manage the land adequately. This does not apply to all ecosystem services, this capacity to find the financial flow, but public policy should be there to put the public funds towards the public goods that we properly identify in the impact assessment. We are ready to provide detail from studies we have done, but I don't have that detail with me, of course.
Yeah, I think there's one more question from Mr. De Groot.
Yeah, one more question on this topic. You say, okay, that it's public money for public goods, but if it's in the interest of the market parties that these ecosystems stay, then shouldn't we change the way the market is functioning in such a way that these costs shouldn't be for the public, but should be incorporated in our food systems so that the way the market is organized is not on the lowest cost, but includes the costs for these public goods?
Absolutely. I mean, whenever you can identify, well, first we do have the polluters pay principle. You are polluting, you're causing a public damage. We know who is the polluter, that polluter should pay. That pre-exists. It's a principle, a good principle that should be further applied. But this issue of when the market benefits, it should pay, yeah, that's where we favor approaches of payment for ecosystem services, which are very relevant. You know, for instance, we know that let's say in forests, timber as such is just around 18% of the value that actually a forest can provide. Not all that value can be, let's say, appropriated by private market flow, but some can. So there's a lot of public policy that can be shaped towards using the funding, taxes, incentives towards payment of ecosystem services, most of which is in the hands of the member states, indeed. So it's a job for the member states, including when shaping restoration and the financial flows around it, to see who benefits, who could be available to put the money on the table, because it will have a return. That does not happen for all the values. Not all values on nature are monetizable also, but if we just take into account the economic value of what nature provides us, we can do a lot better on governance.
Thank you. I'm looking at Mr. Van Kamp. It's online. I couldn't see if you have one more question. No? Okay. Then
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks. Then I'd like to thank Mr. Delgado Rosa for this insightful briefing. Thank you very much. Also, thank you to the members, of course, and the supporting staff. And then I hereby close this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for the very rich questions and debates. Thank you.